As Barry said, our Bible reading is from 1 Samuel 13, starting at verse 23, which is at the top of page 398. Now a detachment of Philistines had gone out to the pass at Michmash. One day, Jonathan, the son of Saul, said to his young armour-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was the son of Ichabod, his brother Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. On each side of the pass that Jonathan intended to cross to reach the Philistines' outpost was a cliff. One was called Bozez and the other Sinai. One cliff stood to the Neph towards Michmash, the other to the south towards Geba. Jonathan said to his young armour-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act in our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." "Do all you have in mind," his armour-bearer said. "Go ahead. I am with you, heart and soul." Jonathan said, "Come on then, we will cross over toward them and let them see us. If they say to us, 'Wait there until we come to you,' we will stay where we are and not go up to them. But if they say, 'Come up to us,' we will climb up, because that will be our sign that the Lord has given them into our hands." So both of them showed themselves to the Philistine outpost. "Look," said the Philistines, "the Hebrews are crawling out of the holes they were hiding in." The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armour-bearer, "Come up to us and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armour-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hand of Israel." Jonathan climbed up using his hands and feet, with his armour-bearer right behind him. The Philistines fell before Jonathan, and his armour-bearer followed and killed behind him. In that first attack, Jonathan and his armour-bearer killed some 20 men in an area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and field, and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. Saul's lookouts at Gibeah in Benjamin saw the army melting away in all directions. Then Saul said to the men who were with him, "Muster the forces and see who has left us." When they did, it was Jonathan and his armour-bearer who were not there. Saul said to Ahijah, "Bring the ark of God." At that time, it was with the Israelites. While Saul was talking to the priest, the tumult in the Philistine camp increased more and more. So Saul said to the priest, "Withdraw your hand." Then Saul and all his men assembled and went to the battle. They found the Philistines in total confusion, striking each other with their swords. Those Hebrews who had previously been with the Philistines and had gone up with them to their camp went over to the Israelites who were with Saul and Jonathan. When all the Israelites who had hidden in the hill country of Ephraim heard that the Philistines were on the run, they joined the battle in hot pursuit. So on that day, the Lord saved Israel, and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. Now the Israelites were in distress that day because Saul had bound the people under an oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, before I have avenged myself on my enemies." So none of the troops tasted food. The entire army entered the woods, and there was honey on the ground. When they went into the woods, they saw the honey oozing out. Yet no one put his hand to his mouth because they feared the oath. But Jonathan had not heard that his father had bound the people with the oath. So he reached out the end of his staff that was in his hand and dipped it into the honeycomb. He raised his hand to his mouth and his eyes brightened. Then one of the soldiers told him, "Your father bound the army under a strict oath, saying, 'Cursed be anyone who eats food today.' That is why the men are faint." Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for the country. See how my eyes brightened when I tasted a little of this honey. How much better it would have been if the men had eaten today some of the plunder they took from their enemies. Would not the slaughter of the Philistines have been even greater?" That day, after the Israelites had struck down the Philistines from Michmash to Aijalon, they were exhausted. They pounced on the plunder, and taking sheep, cattle and calves, they butchered them on the ground and ate them, together with the blood. Then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood in it." "You have broken faith," he said. "Roll a large stone over here at once." Then he said, "Go out among the men and tell them, 'Each of you bring me your cattle and sheep and slaughter them here and eat them. Do not sin against the Lord by eating meat with blood still in it.'" So everyone brought his ox that night and slaughtered it there. Then Saul built an altar to the Lord. It was the first time he had done this. Saul said, "Let us go down and pursue the Philistines by night and plunder them till dawn, and let us not leave one of them alive." "Do whatever seems best to you," they replied. But the priest said, "Let us inquire of God here." So Saul asked God, "Shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Will you give them into Israel's hand?" But God did not answer him that day. Saul therefore said, "Come here, all you who are leaders of the army, and let us find out what sin has been committed today. As surely as the Lord who rescues Israel lives, even if the guilt lies with my son Jonathan, he must die." But not one of them said a word. Saul then said to all the Israelites, "You stand over there, I and Jonathan my son will stand over here." "Do what seems best to you," they replied. Then Saul prayed to the Lord, the God of Israel, "Why have you not answered your servant today? If the fault is in me or my son Jonathan, respond with Urim. But if the men of Israel are at fault, respond with Thummim." Jonathan and Saul were taken by lot, and the men were cleared. Saul said, "Cast the lot between me and Jonathan my son," and Jonathan was taken. Then Saul said to Jonathan, "Tell me what you have done." So Jonathan told him, "I tasted a little honey with the end of my staff, and now I must die." Saul said, "May God deal with me, be it ever so severely, if you do not die, Jonathan." But the men said to Saul, "Should Jonathan die, he who has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground. For he did this today with God's help." So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. Then Saul stopped pursuing the Philistines, and they withdrew to their own land. After Saul had assumed rule over Israel, he fought against their enemies on every side: Moab, the Ammonites, Edom, the kings of Zobar, and the Philistines. Wherever he turned, he inflicted punishment on them. He fought valiantly and defeated the Amalekites, delivering Israel from the hands of those who had plundered them. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
Let's talk about chairs. Think with me about chairs. There we go. Of all the different kinds of rooms in homes and offices and every different kind of room, chairs come under more pressure in the schoolroom than anywhere else, don't they? Do you ever see people leaning back on the two legs of a chair anywhere as much as in the classroom? So often chairs are critical to high school pranks. Whether it be the chair that moves as the person sits, or whether the object placed on the chair prior to the person sitting, or the teacher's chair getting fire hydrants attached to it and getting shot across the room. I start with chairs because that's often how I explain faith. How do you explain faith? What is faith? Faith isn't a commitment of the mind and an opinion. No, faith is active. It's a choice. So you've all sat on a chair today. You've come in, you've intuitively thought, yes, this chair can take my weight, and you've sat. That is an act of faith and an act of dependence. It wasn't just an opinion of yours. You committed your whole body to that act of faith as you sat down. And so far, you're looking pretty good. The faith was vindicated, right? Now, of course, Christians are called on to act in faith, to have faith in God, dependence in God. Not just to think that God is God, but to actually place your weight on him, to commit your mind, body and soul to him. We're coming to 1 Samuel at a place where faith is being tested. Like a chair in high school, faith is being tested. And sadly, Saul's faith was tested last week and found wanting. In the face of overwhelming threat, King Saul broke faith and ignored the command of God. Saul is a king with many admirable qualities, yet we've seen that Saul was disqualified from being king over God's people because he wasn't obedient to God. Now, unless you're a very unusual hearer of that passage, I'm sure you feel a considerable amount of sympathy for Saul. He did what seemed wise, but it was judged to be foolish. He did what seemed to be necessary, but it was found to be condemned. And we sympathise with Saul because we know only too well how difficult it is to follow the command of God. As they say, the hits keep on coming. So the Philistines continue in this passage that Judith read to be a clear and present danger surrounding the king who knows his days are numbered. The Philistine forces are expanding to different places in 1317. Remember from last week how many swords the kingdom had, the kingdom of Israel, how many swords did we have? 2. We only had 2 swords. You remember how many Philistine soldiers there were? More than can be counted, remember that, right? So the odds are still the same. They haven't changed from last week to this. Will this added pressure draw an expression of faith or dependence from the king? Well, the answer is we do see faith here, but not from the king. We see faith from the king's son, Jonathan. So firstly, we're going to look at the faith of Jonathan. And then secondly, we're going to compare that faith to Saul's faith. So let's start with Jonathan. Just observe Jonathan's faith in Yahweh. I say Yahweh because the Old Testament, where the Lord is capitalised, that's shorthand for Yahweh, I am who I am, as he introduces himself in Exodus 3. So 14:1, you got it open in front of you, you there? 14:1. One day Jonathan, son of Saul, said to his young armour-bearer, "Come, let's go to the Philistine outpost on the other side." But he did not tell his father. Saul was staying on the outskirts of Gibeah under a pomegranate tree in Migron. With him were about 600 men, among whom was Ahijah, who was wearing an ephod. He was a son of Ichabod's brother, Ahitub, son of Phinehas, the son of Eli, the Lord's priest in Shiloh. No one was aware that Jonathan had left. In looking at the faith of Jonathan, firstly, just notice the distance between Saul and Jonathan. This is set up as a comparison, right? Immediately you notice the relational distance between Saul and Jonathan. He didn't tell his father he was going. Sons don't tell their fathers their ridiculous plans for a reason, right? Same here. Notice there's a physical distance between Saul and Jonathan. Saul is some way back from the battle line, whereas Jonathan is looking up the steep cliff at the Philistines. Notice that Saul and Jonathan have a different posture. Saul is sitting under a pomegranate tree, presumably in the shade. That sounds nice, doesn't it? Jonathan is standing there looking up the cliff face. But the key difference between Jonathan and Saul is their theology. And the key difference is their faith, theology, who God is and what he does. You can see that in verse 6. Jonathan said to his young armor-bearer, "Come, let's go over to the outpost of those uncircumcised men. Perhaps the Lord will act on our behalf. Nothing can hinder the Lord from saving, whether by many or by few." What an incredible statement of theology that is. What an incredible statement of faith. First, notice how Jonathan views the Philistine soldiers. He regards them as incompatible with Israelites because they are uncircumcised, whereas Israel were committed by circumcision to the living God back in Genesis 17. The significant difference between them is their allegiance to the living God. So Jonathan wasn't presuming upon God either. He says, perhaps. You notice that word there? Perhaps he will save. And the last part of what Jonathan says is nothing can hinder Yahweh from saving by many or by few. The confidence we hear from Jonathan, we hear again from another young lad as he takes on a massive Philistine, Goliath. You remember that? King David, a few chapters later. What does he say as he takes on Goliath? "The Lord has delivered me from a bear. He will deliver me from the hand of this Philistine." You can hear the same attitude there, can't you? More importantly, Jonathan is expressing the conviction that is basic to all faith in God. God is of infinite power. The fact that we don't pray more shows that we don't believe this as thoroughly as we should. Again and again, we hear this through the pages of Scripture. Genesis 18, is anything too hard for the Lord? Job says, "I know that you can do all things. No purpose of yours can be thwarted." And Jeremiah, "Nothing is too hard for you." We're talking about faith. So let me ask you, do you believe this? This is what Jesus taught. This is what the Bible teaches. So how does their difference in theology play out? How does the difference in faith play out for Jonathan? Verse 12. The men of the outpost shouted to Jonathan and his armor-bearer, "Come up here and we'll teach you a lesson." So Jonathan said to his armor-bearer, "Climb up after me. The Lord has given them into the hands of Israel." It's a funny phrase, isn't it? "Come up here, we'll teach you a lesson." What lesson do you think Jonathan learnt? Surely it was a reminder, one of those recap kind of lessons that you have in school, wasn't it? That he learned what already he knew. That is, the Lord will save by many or by few, with the emphasis on the few, right? There are only two of them. And Jonathan continues to recognise and emphasise the work of Yahweh. Yahweh has given them into the hand of Israel. And that's true, of course, in what we see next. You see verse 14? In that first attack, Jonathan and his armor-bearer killed some 20 men in the area of about half an acre. Then panic struck the whole army, those in the camp and the field and those in the outposts and raiding parties, and the ground shook. It was a panic sent by God. It's just another dramatic intervention at the hand of a God who saves. Nobody would have expected this Israelite victory, would they? That's impossible. In view of the difficulties described in the last chapter, The Philistine army goes from being strong, implacable, unrelenting to, described here, what's the word used of the army here? Melting. Those we saw last week had gone into hiding. They jumped up and joined the chase, chasing the Philistines out of the promised land. Jonathan, in his theology, in his trust in Yahweh, acted in line with Yahweh. And so firstly, we see that Jonathan's faith in Yahweh, and we see his faith and we can compare that to his father, secondly. Notice by comparison that Saul's actions threaten his people, in particular Jonathan, and threaten his relationship with Yahweh. You might think that when a victory falls into the lap of a king, that he'd use it. You'd think that, wouldn't you? Here, Saul almost seems to do the opposite. We've already noticed that beginning of the passage that king is back from the front, that rather than staring at Philistine, he's under the shade of a pomegranate tree. Notice the transition from the last part that we've looked at to the focus on Saul. Verse 23, 24, just notice the difference there. Verse 23, and so that day the Lord saved Israel and the battle moved on beyond Beth-aven. Now the Israelites were in distress that day. Do those two ideas go together to you? A question, how could the side that's in the ascendancy, on the rise, be the army that is distressed? Answer, because of a king's oath. Saul had promised the people under oath, saying, "Cursed be anyone who eats food before evening comes, because before I have avenged myself on my enemies." Do you hear what's going on for King Saul there? Saul is not acting for a God who saves, is he? Saul is acting to avenge himself. So none of his troops will eat until Saul has avenged himself on his enemies. So while Jonathan and Yahweh are turning his enemies on themselves and chasing them away, Saul is causing his own people distress. Perhaps Saul made the oath so that the soldiers don't desert like they did earlier. And we see him counting troops in 13:15. Why? Well, because Saul trusts in the number of his soldiers rather than in the strength of his God. He hasn't learnt what Jonathan's been reminded of, that the Lord will save by many or by few. So instead we have an oath that hurts his people and potentially hurts his relationship with God. So his oath hurts people, in particular Jonathan. You see that episode there. Jonathan is torn away from the army with this other maverick, and they were too busy fighting with their 1 to 10 odds to hear Saul's oath. So Jonathan, seeing some honey in the forest, grabs a bite, finding out after the fact that that's contrary to his father's oath. But his son Jonathan provides a pretty stinging commentary about the oath. Verse 29, you see there, Jonathan said, "My father has made trouble for this country." There are two other people in the Bible that are called troublers of Israel. Achan, the idol stealer in Joshua, and then Ahab, the idolatrous king to come. Jonathan adds his father's name right in the middle of that list. Troublers of Israel. Jonathan's point is there would be way less Philistines invading the promised land if our troops were not too famished to chase them. You know, Napoleon said, an army runs on its stomach. Saul's army were running on nothing. Having broken an oath, Jonathan has literally put himself in the firing line. And we'll come back to that in a moment. But you see, the oath also harms Israel's relationship with God. Verse 33, then someone said to Saul, "Look, the men are sinning against the Lord by eating meat that has blood on it." Do you hear what Saul says to them? You have broken faith. Unfortunately, Saul doesn't recognize his part in this disaster that threatens the relationship between God and his people. The oath that brought anger from God risked the food laws. but it also risked their line of communication with God. Do you hear what happens next? Saul intended to continue after the Philistines. Generally, with Israel, this is a kind of action that they go to God and ask God whether we should do this or not. Unfortunately, this wasn't Saul's idea to inquire of God. It had to be suggested to him. But after they inquired of God, this is what we see happen. Verse 37, so Saul asked God, shall I go down and pursue the Philistines? Verse 37, will you give them into Israel's hand? The answer? It's ominous, isn't it? But God did not answer him that day. So Saul identifies that it was Jonathan who caused the breach, so Jonathan must die. But the people wouldn't have it. They recognised that it was because of Jonathan and the Lord that they'd now been in this superior position. Verse 45, but the men said to Israel, should Jonathan die? He has brought about this great deliverance in Israel? Never. As surely as the Lord lives, not a hair of his head will fall to the ground, for he did this day with God's help. So the men rescued Jonathan, and he was not put to death. So the people recognise what we recognise as we read this account. Jonathan acted in faith in Yahweh. It's Jonathan's actions under God that has turned this battle around. Verse 45, Jonathan worked with God. Whereas by comparison, his dad, King Saul, has just caused the people distress with an oath of personal vengeance, an oath that almost cost his son his life, an oath that threatened the obedience of his people, an oath that threatened open communication with the Lord who saves. You stand back with that comparison. Jonathan put it all on the line in his confidence to God, didn't he? Saul put it all on the line, but without faith. He put it all on the line for personal vengeance. Saul was a king, but Jonathan acted like the one who ought to have been king, didn't he? Jonathan, in this passage, has no position of power. He's the king's son, but there's no position of power there. He puts his faith and trust in God, and God exalts him and fights before him and with him. Jonathan prevails not on his own strength, but on the Lord's strength. If anyone's a precursor to Christ in this passage, it's Jonathan. Do you notice he's humble? He's got no apparent self-interest. He fights for God's people. He's willing to suffer for others. He's an agent of salvation. He's not zealous for fame or honour or kingship. He's such a model to us. He points us towards the true King of Israel, Jesus, the first one to fully trust in God. Philippians 2:8, or as we prayed earlier this morning, the one who became the pioneer and perfecter of faith, Hebrews 12. So just as I conclude, I want us to come back to the chair. I use the chair to illustrate what faith is like. Faith is dependence. Faith is trust. So are you going to place your weight in it or not? That's the question. I wonder whether the opportunities that we get to place our faith in God don't always look as certain as a chair that sits before us. Now, I wonder if sometimes we're given an opportunity to place our weight in God, and the chair kind of looks a little bit three-legged, or the chair looks like it's being wrestled by teenage boys, or the chair's being shot across the room by fire hydrants. Sometimes the situation in which we're asked to place our faith in God, the chair doesn't look so good. And we're thinking, well, I don't like the look of that. You're asking me to have faith, but I'm not quite sure about that. Perhaps you're facing a situation you haven't faced before. Perhaps you're suffering in a way that you haven't suffered before. Perhaps your faith is prompting you to go out on a limb that really feels uncomfortable. I don't know. But the context of the challenge to your faith may not look like a safe chair. Jonathan's demonstration of faith came at a time when he was looking up a cliff face that was so steep it was named. And he had faith in God. Faith didn't look like a well-constructed chair for Jonathan, did it? Whereas Saul, by comparison, had decisions that looked sensible. He was counting his troops. He was staying away from the front, so that an errant spear wouldn't get him. You'd trust Saul with your super rather than Jonathan, wouldn't you? But in each of these actions, you see so clearly where the faith lies, don't you? The one who demonstrated faith was the one who you'd call a bit young and a bit rash, rather than the old and sensible one. Does your faith ever look young and rash like Jonathan's? Does your faith in your saving God ever prompt you to do something a bit young and rash? Telling someone about Jesus who you'd never imagine would listen, giving a large amount of money to a gospel cause, making a significantly costly personal decision that most people would go, that's a bit rash. I don't know what it is for you, but perhaps that's one of the reasons that Jesus told the kids, let the children come to me, for the kingdom of God belongs to such as these. William Carey, missionary, was on the cusp of a missionary trip to India, and he looked out at a complacent church in the 18th century, and he said to them, expect great things from God and attempt great things for God. As he said that, he could have picked Jonathan as his model, right? Jonathan demonstrates faith in a God who saves. He expected great things from God, and he attempted great things for God. Will you? Will you expect great things from God? Will you attempt great things for God? Only with his help. So let's pray. Dear Father in heaven, you can do immeasurably more than all we ask or imagine according to your power that is at work within us. Father, help us. Help us to humbly expect great things from you, and help us to attempt great things for you, that it might be for your glory in the church and in Christ Jesus throughout all generations, forever and ever. Amen.